On February 28, 1993, a 51-day standoff between the ATF and a group of Seventh-day Adventists would begin. This group called themselves the Branch Davidians, and this standoff would burn itself into the heart of America for decades to come as the reports of the death rate and the details of the event made its way across our country. Today, we remember this event and the victims who were involved. Hello everyone, and welcome to The Gray. Okay, so something different to note this time around. There is or may be accompanying footage along with audio snippets. If I decide to use any of them, the ones that I can find at least, I promise you will be able to stomach them. I'm not going to be using anything too distressful or brutal, so you can lower your anxiety a bit there. With that being said, I want this to be loud and clear. The things that I discuss in this video, sometimes with heavy detail, are topics of death and destruction, and some of these things even happen to children, so viewer discretion is advised if you choose to continue. Now, I'll try not to censor myself as much as possible. While I do have your thoughts and feelings on these matters in mind, I also want to iterate that I strongly believe that all of the victims in the events that I cover fully deserve 100% of their story to be told. Even if it does get a little on the disturbing side sometimes. Like I said, in this video, we're not going to be doing that as much, but please keep that in mind for later videos, and you really can't change my mind on this, so sorry. Last thing, thank you guys so much for the support on my first ever video essay, Ruby Ridge. If you haven't seen that before, I'll leave the link down in the description. I was pretty nervous about doing that, hoping I didn't miss anything, but you guys seem to like it, so here we are with the next one. And without further ado, let's get into it. For this story to make sense, we have to look at the nature and actions of a group known as the Branch Davidians. The Branch Davidians are a subgroup of the Davidians, which were founded in 1929 by Victor Houteff. I'm not trying to pronounce that name again, and was a small Seventh-day Adventist reform movement. 6 years after the founding of the Davidians, Victor and 37 of his followers established the Mount Carmel Center, just 2 miles from Waco, Texas. The community began to expand here, growing to around 90 people before 1955. It was right about now that Victor's hold on the group began to shine through, as many believed him to be the only individual that was capable of revealing biblical secrets about the end of time. He often stated during his teaching that he would lead his people to the heavenly Canaan that was promised, basically meaning leading them to paradise. He also believed that he would not die, at least until the shepherding of his people was complete. So already we're starting off with a little bit of manipulation here, and it's really not hard to believe when people who know about this incident think think back on the actual acts of the event and the kind of people that we were dealing with that were at the head of it all. So because of all of that, you can imagine how shocking it was to the Davidians when Victor suddenly passed away at Hillcrest Hospital due to heart failure. This led to some instability and the formation of a few splinter groups. Prior to his passing, Victor left his second wife, Florence Houteff, in charge, quote, until the Lord chooses another prophet to take charge. Under her leadership, the Davidians relocated to a 941-acre farm 9 miles east of Waco. They called this new location, you guessed it, New Mount Carmel. Man, I think these guys are shaping up to be the most creative people I've ever seen. This, of course, came with a new prophecy that predicted the coming of God's kingdom on April 22nd, 1959. I assume they chose this date because it coincided with Passover, which is another significant day in Christian religion. They called on every member of these splinter groups to show up at New Mount Carmel before this date, and the turnout was actually pretty impressive, with about 900 people showing up. It didn't last too long, however, as people began dispersing. once they realized that there were indeed no sign of the end times as they were made to believe. Once faith began to dwindle at this gathering, a man named Benjamin Roden, who is a former Seventh-day Adventist, began to proclaim that he was the sign that the Davidians were waiting for. This is really just like handing off from person to person, and it's pretty clear to see how this is already going to turn into some type of power play. The Davidians were already divided due to the failure of the prophecy proposed by Florence, so we can see why a small portion of people broke off from the Davidians and began looking toward Benjamin Roden as their new prophet. Benjamin Roden's group claimed the new Mount Carmel property, which was now 77 acres. Roden's teachings mainly focused on the return of Christ to earth and how they may prepare for such an event. Pretty typical for most of these kind of specialized religious groups that we've talked about. It was even believed by Roden that the return of Christ would be prophesied by the restoration of the state of Israel. This then led him to travel to Israel and later establish a small following there prior to his death in 1978. Benjamin's wife, Lois Roden, assumed control of the Branch Davidians following the death of her husband. We can see a pattern here, okay? The pattern's emerging. Her teachings were actually considered to be circulating from the feminist movement in the 1970s, often teaching the female nature of the Holy Spirit and the co-dominion of women and men in the church. Hoping to speak to a wider audience, she began publishing a journal detailing women's place in religion. Along with that, she also began speaking to media outlets, whichever ones that she could, about similar teachings. Throughout Lois's leadership, her son began claiming to be the next heir to lead the Branch Davidians. However, this didn't sit well with many of the followers, as he wasn't widely respected within the community. On top of that, his own mother didn't even support his claim. Instead, a young and charismatic Bible teacher who had first arrived at Mount Carmel in 1981 caught her eye. And this teacher's name was Vernon Howell. Vernon Howell was born on August 17th, 1959 in Houston, Texas. Due to poor study skills and dyslexia, he had to attend special education classes in school growing up. So the fact that he was even a successful Bible teacher, to me, that's beyond me. George wasn't too happy with his mother taking a liking to Vernon, and despite her affection for Vernon, her son George still managed to gain control of Mount Carmel in 1985, even expelling Howell's rival faction at gunpoint. That is rather telling of how the leaders of this group can act, I think. Howell fled, resettling himself and his followers to Palestine, Texas. Palestine, Texas. Yes, it's a thing in the U.S. I checked. But they shortly returned to Mount Carmel 2 years later out of absolute pettiness in order to regain control of the land. Howell, along with 8 men, exchanged gunfire with Roden on November 3rd of 1987 before being arrested for attempted murder. Howell's case was declared a mistrial, and his followers were left off with a warning. Why? On top of that, okay, not even finished, because Roden owed thousands of dollars in taxes on Mount Carmel, Howell was actually able to raise the funds and claim the property for himself. I don't understand this whole situation and couldn't really find any further context for this, but here we are. Howell continued to follow distinct Davidian traditions, including authoritarian leadership, communal life separated from society, and of course, the anticipation of the coming apocalypse. Howell began having what he believed to be heavenly premonitions, or visions from God. He believed himself to be the one to carry out the missions from heaven to defeat all of God's enemies. He believed in this so much that in 1990 he changed his name from Vernon Howell to David Koresh. David refers to the biblical name David, also connecting to the throne of David, in which, and I quote, Jesus would occupy on his return. Koresh refers to the biblical name Cyrus, which is the king of Persia mentioned in Isaiah 45. Believe it or not, even before the name change, David's followers already started to see him as a Messiah, even proclaiming him as such. He also believed that he could unlock the 7 seals from the Bible's book of Revelation and bring about the end times himself. So, up until this point, I really wondered what the end goal was, because at first we were preparing for the end times, and now we have a man named David Koresh who believes he can break the 7 seals in Revelation and bring about the end times assumingly on purpose. You got me. We're gonna continue. Apparently, the name change also marked a change fundamentally in David himself, and it's this change that would launch the Branch Davidians into unknown territory. While all previous leadership had been passive up until this point, David began stockpiling weapons and ammunition to, and I quote, defend the faithful. He also soon began taking spiritual wives. He had a few of them. Several of them were reported to be as young as 11 years old. If you can't tell, things are ramping up pretty fast. In 1989, he declared himself above the rest of the men in the group and proclaimed himself to be the ideal mate of all females. And of course, it was around this time when David revealed his new idea of creating a new lineage of children that he of course believed would rule the world in a literal sense. In 1993, this is a really random thing, David randomly started a retail gun business and began stockpiling so many weapons, it didn't take long for most authoritative figures to start paying attention. This, coupled with the fact that most of his wives were teenagers and underage for that matter, it didn't look very good for David. Keep in mind here that the authorities were not familiar with the beliefs and the group's system of living, and to them, this looked like the Branch Davidians were gearing up for something big. So it wasn't really surprising when the ATF was prepared to meet the Branch Davidians exactly where they were. It's here I should mention that the ATF acquired a search warrant for Mount Carmel and an arrest warrant for David Koresh. It's said that the ATF went into this knowing well enough that this interaction wasn't going to be peaceful, and so much so that they actually planned for it to go sour. For weeks leading up to this event, the ATF actually made a mock-up of the compound and ran operations as they prepared to raid the home of the Davidians, and these were akin to military operations. There was something pretty fishy about why the ATF said that they had to raid the compound on foot. They kind of made it seem like David Koresh never left the building, when in fact he left the building as often as any normal person would. David went on walks. He went running at the same times every morning. He was actually a very nature-centric guy. He even played in a band that performed on weekends, along with taking care of a lot of the grocery shopping himself for the entire compound. So he left the building often, and according to reports, the ATF actually had agents following and watching Koresh almost every day leading up to all of this. So the raid really wasn't necessary. The ATF, in my opinion, just wanted the fight, and the Branch Davidians actually found out in a pretty hilarious way. A local reporter had asked a mailman how to get to Mount Carmel because this huge raid was about to take place. And as it turns out, the mailman was a Branch Davidian. It was actually David Koresh's brother-in-law. Of course, he then rushed home to Mount Carmel and told everyone there about the impending doom headed their way, and it said that everyone began to pray. On the morning of February 28th, 1993, some 70 ATF agents descended on the compound. These guys were dressed in full kit, Kevlar, the whole 9 yards. They even had armored vehicles, including tanks, all to carry out a search and arrest warrant. It's at this point that I figured out the ATF actually had an undercover agent planted on the inside. David Koresh, over time, had actually figured out the true identity of this agent and let him hang around anyway. David would now approach this agent, begging him to tell the ATF to call off the raid, since there were women and children present inside the compound. This little rat of a human being decides to pretend not to know what David is talking about, and slips out the front door during the commotion. There's a huge gap here when discussing who fired first, the Branch Davidians or the ATF. Personally, I think it's a good idea just to give the retelling that I think makes the most sense. It's said that David Koresh stepped out of the door with his hands in the air to warn the ATF that women and children were inside the compound. At this point, this is one of the retellings, the ATF agents killed 5 guard dogs just outside the entrance of the compound on the eastern side. Why this happened, I really have no idea. At any rate, the Branch Davidians inside thought they were being attacked and of course began returning fire from the upper floors of the compound. It's believed that David Koresh was shot in the stomach and in the hand when the ATF began returning fire as well, although some reports say he was likely shot later. Either way, he was able to stumble back inside the front door safely. The details on this moment are incredibly shaky. Many different government sources say that the Branch Davidians opened fire on the ATF first, but this is contested by surviving members of the Branch Davidians who were present at the time. It is also believed that the gunfight could have been caused by the accidental discharge of an ATF agent's weapon system. Either way, the entire compound had erupted in gunfire, with the ATF taking cover behind armored vehicles and the Branch Davidians returning fire from the higher windows. This initial gunfight killed 4 ATF agents and 6 Branch Davidians. Moments after the gunfire started, a man inside the compound named Wayne Martin had called 911, begging for the ATF to stop the onslaught of hellfire hitting the compound. All of this could actually be heard by emergency services on the other end of the line.
Hello? Hello? Yeah, this is Lieutenant Lynch. May I help you?
Yeah, there's 75 men around our building and they're shooting at us in Mount Carmel.
Mount Carmel?
Yeah, tell them there are children and women in here and to call it off.
All right, hello? I hear gunfire. Oh.
By this point, Army National Guard helicopters started circling the compound, even taking oncoming fire from the Branch Davidians leaning out of the windows. Like I said, this gunfight killed 10 people total, and you can imagine how high tensions were since each side was convinced that the other had attacked first. The remaining 61 adults and 21 children made it known that they weren't leaving the compound, which officially began the Waco standoff. At one point during the standoff, the ATF had attempted to climb onto the eastern roof of the compound while the others approached from the west. 4 agents trying to enter the compound on the west side took oncoming fire from inside a window in the compound. 3 of those agents made it inside, with the last agent being struck and wounded by gunfire before he could enter the window. The agents on the inside managed to kill 1 Branch Davidian, and while the other 2 agents were wounded, the 3rd agent covered their retreat. 2 agents made it out the window, and the 3rd agent was killed before he could as well. I want to point out something really important. All of this bloodshed and gunfire initially had only stopped because the ATF was running out of ammunition. These are wild times. For the next 51 days, David Koresh would only have contact with the outside world through 25 FBI negotiators. This contact was made over 754 phone calls. At one point, the FBI actually sent in a video recorder, and Koresh used it as a way to let the outside world know what was really going on. In the video, he shows a lot of his followers, some of which claim to be pregnant with David's children. It's said that some 14 children were fathered by David Koresh, and all of the mothers of those children said to be underage. The video continues in a very Jonestown type of way, and that the whole purpose of the video was to tell the world that no one was being kept hostage, and that anyone that wanted to leave absolutely could. On April 1st, a slew of Army vehicles, including tanks equipped with tear gas, began patrolling the compound. I'm quoting this here. Often tanks would be seen repeatedly driving over the grave of late Branch Davidian Peter Gent. All of this despite protests by the Branch Davidians and even the FBI's own negotiators. This continued for a while, and on April 19th, the FBI began launching tear gas into the compound, claiming that they heard shots coming from inside and wanted to get the children out of harm's way and end the standoff. Both President Bill Clinton and Attorney General Jeanette Reno gave the go-ahead to ram the building with tanks, which is how they would get the tear gas inside. Shortly after this, the building caught fire, and how that exactly happened is still up for debate. The people that saw my Ruby Ridge video may indeed remember a name, Juan Horiuchi. Now, Juan Horiuchi was part of the sniper team at Ruby Ridge who ended up killing the wife of Randy Weaver for, no discernible reason. Well, he ended up being a part of the sniper team stationed at the compound in Waco, Texas as well. I've come across a theory that says that Juan shot a single bullet inside the compound windows, which ignited the fire to begin with. Now, while we all love to hate on our guy Juan, I really don't think this was the case, because the fire actually started at 3 separate locations of the compound, and I don't really see how one bullet can be the culprit. Another theory was that the Branch Davidians literally couldn't breathe from the tear gas, and some people, maybe, put others out of their misery. That, of course, would cause gunfire to erupt, which is the explosion of black powder, which causes a spark and ignites the tear gas. This theory, unfortunately, includes children too. I didn't really find much concrete evidence here, minus a few articles claiming that they got it from other sources, so take those with a grain of salt. The last theory was one that was in a 2000s report by a former senator. This report found that the Davidians spread fuel throughout the compound to start and feed the flames. However, this former senator was appointed by the Attorney General to give this report, and the Attorney General was the one who gave the green light for the attack in the first place, so I don't really know about that one either. Either way, 76 Branch Davidians, that includes 24 teenagers and children, perished in the fire. That leaves 9 of them left alive to walk away from the flames, engulfing the people that they love and cherished. This was an incredibly tragic story that I first heard when I was about 14 years old, and I absolutely wanted to dig into it myself. 2 other channels to note here, one being Wendigoon, obviously, who has a lot more heavier detail about the same topic, so check that out if you're interested. The other is a YouTube channel called Forgotten History, which isn't as big of a channel as Wendigoon, but still helped me a ton watching their videos on it, so check that out as well. So here we are again, reminded of our own mortality, but that's the way it should be in my opinion. Live your life as you wish to live it, and attempt with everything you have to treat people with kindness, compassion, or even tolerance, honestly. Okay, take a breath. Let's all remember that we're okay. Take a break if you have to. I know this stuff can get heavy. And I'll see you all very soon.